So, in the late 19th century, medical researchers started doing something that, from the outside, probably looked completely insane.
Yeah, totally unhinged.
Right. They started taking these massive farm horses, bringing them into laboratories, and just intentionally injecting them with the deadliest biological toxin known to humanity at the time.
And they weren't trying to kill the horses.
No, not at all. They were actually hoping to pull a literal miracle out of their blood to save children who were, well, suffocating to death in hospital wards.
Which is an incredible piece of history on its own.
Exactly. But today we are taking a deep dive into a text that claims that exact biological process, an innocent host taking a lethal hit to produce a life-saving serum, is actually the precise mechanical blueprint for understanding how to save the human soul.
It's an incredibly audacious premise. I mean, we are looking at a work that attempts to bridge two realms that modern culture usually insists on keeping completely separated.
Right, like oil and water.
Yeah. On one side, you have the highly empirical, observable, microscope-driven world of modern immunology. And then on the other side, you have the deeply abstract, invisible, millennia-old world of Christian theology.
And the book we're using for this deep dive is called Analysis Biblico-Scientificas, or Biblical Scientific Analyses. It's by Ozair da Silva Mota.
Specifically, we're zeroing in on Chapter 5.
Right, which carries a title that immediately gives away this collision of worlds. It's called Victors by the Blood of the Lamb, the Discovery, Production, and Action of Vaccines.
Such a wild title.
It really is. So for this deep dive, we are going to scrutinize both the scientific approach and the biblical theological approach that the author takes. We're going to look at the mechanics of biological pathogens, the history of how humanity learned to manufacture immunity, and then overlay that exact template onto the doctrine of spiritual redemption.
And the unifying thread here, the core thesis he presents, is this concept of a totally unsurvivable threat that absolutely requires an external savior.
An outside cure.
Right. He argues that humanity faces enemies on two fronts, the biological and the spiritual. And in both arenas, the human organism is fundamentally incapable of generating its own cure from scratch once that lethal agent gets in.
So you can just fight it off by trying harder.
Exactly. Victory, whether it's against a microscopic bacteria or a spiritual corruption, it just cannot be achieved through sheer human willpower or, moral performance or religious discipline. It relies exclusively on an antidote produced outside the infected body.
And Modi's anchors this whole idea in a verse from the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verse 11. It says, "They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb."
Which is a phrase you hear a lot.
Yeah, constantly in theological spaces. At the point where it almost becomes a cliche, it loses its visceral impact.
It just becomes church jargon.
Exactly. But Moda is arguing that if we actually look at the literal medical application of how blood serum is used to neutralize a toxic agent, that theological cliche suddenly becomes a very precise mechanical description of an antidote.
But before we get to the laboratory, before we start talking about the horses and the antibodies, we have to establish the threat vector.
Right. What are we actually fighting? If we need a miraculous cure, what exactly is the disease?
So Moda spends the first portion of his analysis defining this threat. And he breaks it down into the three classic enemies of the human spirit that are recognized in Christian tradition.
Okay.
If you're going to understand the spiritual immune response, we have to map out these pathogens. He categorizes them as the flesh, the world, and the devil.
I want to stop right immediately on that first one, the flesh, because the linguistic baggage attached to that word is just massive.
Oh, yeah. It's very misunderstood.
If someone tells me my enemy is the flesh, my 21st century brain immediately assumes we are talking about physical matter, like my skin, my muscles, my biological drives. It sounds like the human body itself is the villain.
And you're touching on a historical misunderstanding that Moda explicitly dismantles. That assumption that physical matter is inherently evil, it actually originates more from ancient Greek philosophy.
Really? Like Plato?
Yes, specifically variations of Gnosticism and Platonism. It doesn't come from original biblical texts, but that Greek philosophical virus kind of infected early theological thought and really peaked during the Middle Ages.
Oh, I'm thinking of the monks.
Exactly. You had entire movements built around asceticism and self-flagellation. People genuinely believed that their literal anatomy was the root of their spiritual failure.
Wow.
They thought if they starved the body or beat the body or even mutilated it, they were surgically removing the source of sin.
Which implies that sin is like a biological organ you can just cut out.
Right. which is completely false.
So if I'm reading Mota correctly, he's arguing that the flesh, in a theological context, the fallen Adamic nature, is entirely immaterial.
That is the crucial distinction. The text clarifies that sin originates in the immaterial dimension of the human being. We are talking about the mind, the will, the core affections.
The inner life.
Yeah, the physical body is merely the instrument. It's the hardware that executes the corrupted software commands.
Okay, that makes sense.
Think about the mechanics of malice. Hatred doesn't generate in your knuckles. It doesn't originate in your vocal cords. It is born in the immaterial will. Your mind computes a desire to harm, and your physical body simply complies by throwing the punch or shouting the insult.
Right.
The body is neutral. The driving immaterial nature is what Mota defines as the flesh.
So if I can use a modern analogy, the flesh is basically a corrupted operating system.
I like that.
It's this base code that defaults to selfishness, pride, and rebellion against its original designer. And what I find fascinating is how Mota uses the Apostle Paul to illustrate the sheer psychological exhaustion of trying to manually override this corrupted operating system.
Yeah, Romans 7.
Yeah, he points to Romans chapter 7, where Paul, who is arguably one of the most disciplined, highly educated religious scholars of his entire era, is essentially having a public breakdown over this internal civil war.
Paul's admission there is just a brilliant piece of psychological realism. He writes, "For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing."
It's so relatable.
He really is. Paul is describing a divided will. He possesses the intellectual knowledge of what the moral law requires, and his conscious mind even desires to comply with it. But there is a deeper, entrenched algorithmic bias, the flesh, that actively sabotages his actions.
But wait, if the enemy is that deeply embedded, if the call is literally coming from inside the house, and even someone like Paul is throwing his hands up in defeat, how does that not lead to total despair?
Just bleak picture.
Yeah, if you can't trust your own internal hardware, what is the survival strategy?
Well, Mota argues that if the story ended with human capability, it absolutely would result in despair. The theological framework he is building posits that you cannot bootstrap your way out of a corrupted nature, using the very nature that is corrupted.
You can't fix the code with the broken code.
Exactly. You cannot debug the software using the faulty code itself. So the perseverance of the believer doesn't depend on their own exhausting moral gymnastics. It relies entirely on an external redemptive intervention.
Okay, so that's the first enemy, the internal one.
Right. But the flesh is only 1/3 of the threat matrix. It's the internal vulnerability. The second enemy he introduces is the external environment that exploits that vulnerability.
Enemy number 2, the world.
Yes.
And just like with the flesh, we need to strip away the colloquial definition here, because when the text says the world, it is not talking about the physical biosphere.
No, it's not anti-nature.
Right. It's not condemning mountains or oceans or carbon-based life forms.
When you read injunctions in texts like 1 John or the Book of James warning against friendship with the world, it is targeting a sociocultural operating system. Mota defines the world as an organized system of values, philosophies, and power structures that are built in deliberate opposition to, or at least in total ignorance of, the Creator.
So it's humanity trying to build a utopia without God.
Exactly. It is humanity attempting to construct a self-sustaining reality where God is rendered irrelevant.
Let's dig into the mechanics of how the system actually operates, because Mota's breakdown of its characteristics feels incredibly modern.
Very applicable to today.
He says this system absolutizes the present. It insists that the material here and now is the only reality that matters, and it completely amputates any concept of eternity. It exalts pleasure as the highest moral good, and it relativizes ethics based entirely on situational advantage.
If we tie this back to your software analogy from earlier, the flesh is the internal vulnerability, and the world is the external user interface that is perfectly designed to keep you clicking.
Oh, wow, that's a great way to put it.
What makes the world so exceptionally dangerous, as Mota points out, is its methodology. It rarely relies on brute force coercion.
It's sneaky.
Yeah, it relies on persuasion.
It doesn't put a gun to your head. It tailors an algorithm to your specific desires. Mota uses words like colorful, attractive, intellectually sophisticated, and emotionally stimulating to describe the world system.
It's seductive.
It infiltrates academia, politics, art, and media. It presents a version of reality that is intensely flattering to the human ego.
However, Mota introduces a critical theological boundary here, And this is important to prevent the reader from falling into fatalism.
Right.
Because a common misinterpretation of verses like 1 John 5:19, which states that the whole world lies in the power of the evil one, is that God has completely abandoned the board.
Like, he just walked away.
Yeah, and that the enemy has total jurisdictional control over all human institutions.
Which would mean that participating in society at all is a sin. Like, if the system is totally compromised, your only option is to run into the desert and become a hermit.
Precisely. But Mota forcefully rejects that kind of isolationism. He maintains that divine sovereignty remains absolute. Human institutions are deeply flawed because they are populated by humans operating under the flesh, but they are not beyond the reach of divine grace.
Okay, so how does he prove that?
To prove this, he points to the historical narrative of Daniel and Babylon.
Babylon, which is basically the biblical archetype for the ultimate corrupt world system.
Yes.
It was an empire built entirely on conquest, pride, and paganism.
And look at how Babylon operated. When they took Daniel and the other youths captive, they didn't just throw them in a dungeon.
No, they put them in the university, basically.
Exactly. They attempted a total cultural assimilation. They changed their names to honor Babylonian gods. They immersed them in Babylonian literature and science, and they tried to change their diet.
The persuasion machine.
It was the ultimate sophisticated persuasion machine. Yet Daniel not only survives, he thrives. He maintains his theological integrity while serving the highest echelons of that very government.
Wow.
So Mota uses this to demonstrate that the believer is called to navigate the world system, not evacuate it. God raises up faithful agents to operate within corrupt structures.
So we have the internal saboteur, the flesh. We have the external sociocultural matrix, the world. And that brings us to the third and final antagonist in this theological triad. Right. This is where the threat goes from a corrupted nature and a corrupt system to an active personal intelligence.
Mota describes him using his traditional biblical titles, the ancient serpent, Satan, the deceiver, the accuser. But what is most vital for our analysis is understanding his operational parameters.
What he can and can't do.
Yes. Mota is very careful to avoid dualism. Satan is not an anti-God. He does not possess omniscience, omnipresence, or creative power.
He's not God's equal opposite.
Exactly. He is a created being, and therefore his power is strictly limited and subordinate to divine sovereignty.
But if he can't create, what is his mechanism of attack? How does he actually do damage?
Distortion. Mota outlines that the devil's primary weapon is the manipulation of information. He does not invent new truths. He takes existing reality and subtly twists it.
He bends it.
Yeah, he mixes truth with error. He's the ultimate architect of disinformation.
It's essentially a spiritual phishing attack. He sends a message that looks 99% legitimate, but it contains a malicious payload.
That's exactly it.
And according to Mota, the devil rarely attacks directly. He uses the first two enemies as his instruments, right? He leverages the deceptive allure of the world system to trigger the selfish appetites of the flesh.
His entire strategic goal is separation. He wants to sever the communion between humanity and God, paralyze their spiritual effectiveness, and just drown them in accusation.
So when you synthesize these three threat vectors, the internal corruption, the external cultural pressure, and an active, intelligent adversary orchestrating the deception, Mota's conclusion becomes mathematically inevitable.
It's zero.
Right. The human organism, operating on its own natural resources, has a 0% survival rate. It is an unwinnable war.
It is a terrifying diagnosis.
Yeah.
You are outgunned on every conceivable front. And, if this was just a philosophical thought experiment, we'd be left staring into the abyss.
Just totally hopeless.
But Mota insists the diagnosis is only half the equation. The cure exists. And the mechanism of that cure, the blood of the Lamb, is what we have to understand next.
And to explain how an external victory can actually be applied to an infected host, Mota takes us completely out of ancient theology and drops us directly into the history of 19th century medical science.
Right. We are transitioning from the abstract spiritual pathogen to a very real, very lethal biological pathogen.
This is where it gets really intense.
Mota uses the history of immunology to create a tangible mechanical model of redemption. And the specific disease he chooses to anchor this scientific exploration is diphtheria.
Diphtheria. For anyone living before the 20th century, that word was just a nightmare. It earned the horrifying moniker, the scourge of childhood.
This is devastating.
Mota details the pathology of this disease, and I really want to spend a moment on the cellular mechanics of how it actually operated, because understanding the lethality of the toxin is essential to understanding the miracle of the antidote.
Absolutely. So diphtheria is caused by a rod-shaped bacterium called Corynebacterium diphtheria. But the bacteria itself, the actual physical microorganism, isn't what primarily kills the patient.
Mm.
No, it's what the bacteria manufactures. Once it colonizes the respiratory tract, usually taking hold in the tonsils or throat, it begins excreting an incredibly potent exotoxin right into the bloodstream.
This toxin is a molecular assassin. Mota describes how it travels through the blood and systematically attacks the heart muscle, the kidneys, and the peripheral nervous system.
Brutal.
It literally halts protein synthesis in the host's cells, causing massive tissue death. But what it does locally, right there in the throat where the infection starts, is what terrified parents the most.
Yeah, this is the really grim part. The toxin destroys the epithelial cells in the throat, and as that dead tissue accumulates, along with white blood cells and fibrin, it forms what medical literature calls a pseudomembrane.
A fake skin, basically.
Right. It is this thick, grayish, leathery coating that aggressively spreads across the tonsils, the pharynx, and down into the larynx.
It creates a literal physical barrier over the airway. The child slowly, agonizingly suffocates to death over a period of days, while their internal organs are simultaneously shutting down from the systemic toxin.
And for centuries, medical science was functionally useless against it. Doctors would try to physically rip the membrane out of the throat,
Oh.
which usually just caused massive bleeding and accelerated death. It was an unbeatable biological enemy. The human immune system, especially in a child, simply could not generate antibodies fast enough to neutralize the toxin before it caused fatal damage.
This is the baseline of total incapacity that Mota wants you to grasp. The patient is dying, their internal defense mechanisms have failed, and they require an external intervention to survive.
And this leads Mota into a chronological exploration of how humanity slowly discovered the mechanics of acquired immunity.
Starting with Edward Jenner.
Right, he starts, as any history of immunology must,
Yeah.
with Jenner in 1796.
Jenner was an English country physician who noticed a highly specific pattern regarding smallpox. Smallpox was a devastating plague, killing roughly 30% of those infected and severely scarring the survivors.
It was a global terror.
But Jenner observed that milkmaids, young women who spent their days milking cows, almost never caught smallpox.
What they did catch was a related, much milder virus called cowpox, which they contracted from the udders of the cows. They would get a few pustules on their hands, feel mildly unwell for a few days, and then recover fully.
And Jenner hypothesized that surviving the mild cowpox infection somehow granted the body an invisible shield against the lethal smallpox infection.
So to test this, Jenner did something that would absolutely never pass a modern ethics board.
No, he would be in prison today.
Definitely. He took pus from a cowpox lesion on a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms, and he deliberately inoculated an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps.
Wow.
The boy got a mild case of cowpox. Months later, Jenner intentionally exposed the boy to actual lethal smallpox.
That is so risky.
But the boy showed no symptoms. He was completely immune.
Jenner essentially proved the concept of cross-immunity. And Mota points out a wonderful piece of etymological history here that I loved. The Latin word for cow is vacca, and the term for cowpox was variola vaccinae. So when Jenner published his findings, he called the procedure vaccination, literally meaning relating to the cow.
The entire foundation of modern immunology is linguistically tied to the sacrifice of livestock.
It's an incredible origin story. But Jenner's method was limited, right? Because it relied on finding a naturally occurring, closely related, mild virus. You can't just hope there's a safe animal version of every single deadly human disease.
Exactly. So Mota then tracks the science forward to Louis Pasteur in the late 19th century. Pasteur figures out how to manipulate the pathogens themselves.
So he didn't need a lucky cowpox scenario.
Right. Pasteur discovers the principle of attenuation. Through a series of experiments initially working with chicken cholera and later rabies, Pasteur realizes that he doesn't need a naturally mild cousin virus. He can take the actual deadly pathogen, bring it into his laboratory, and intentionally damage it.
He weakens it.
Yeah, by exposing the microorganism to oxygen over long periods or passing it through unnatural hosts, he could weaken its virulence. It was still the same disease, but its offensive capabilities were crippled.
He essentially disarmed the bomb. If you inject that weakened pathogen into a patient, it doesn't have the strength to kill them, but it absolutely triggers their immune system.
The body recognizes the intruder, analyzes its molecular structure, and manufactures custom-built proteins to destroy it. We call those proteins antibodies.
And once the immune system learns how to make the specific antibody for that disease, it retains the blueprint.
Exactly. The body creates a memory of the victory. But here's the problem. Both Jenner and Pasteur were dealing with active immunization. You have to give the vaccine before the person gets sick so their body has time to prepare.
Right, it's preventative.
But what happens if the patient is already infected? What happens if the child is already suffocating from the diphtheria membrane?
A vaccine won't work fast enough. The toxin is already in the blood.
And this is where the history hits the exact parallel Mota needs for his theological analogy. It's 1890, and a German physiologist named Emil von Behring, working alongside a Japanese physician named Shibasaburo Kitasato, cracks the code for a cure.
Von Behring focuses specifically on the diphtheria exotoxin. He realizes that if he takes a highly diluted, sublethal dose of the pure toxin and injects it into an animal, the animal's immune system will react violently and flood its bloodstream with antibodies specifically engineered to neutralize that exact toxin.
And von Behring called these specific antibodies antitoxins.
Here is the massive breakthrough. Von Behring proved that he could draw blood from the surviving animal, separate out the clear liquid serum that contained all the antitoxins, and inject that animal serum directly into a human child who was actively dying of diphtheria.
The human child's immune system hadn't produced the cure, but the animal's antibodies would circulate through the child's blood, hunt down the diphtheria toxin, bind to it, and completely neutralize it.
The child recovers because an external organism fought the battle for them and transferred the victory via its blood.
It was a monumental paradigm shift in medicine. They called it passive immunity. But to produce this antitoxin serum on a scale large enough to supply hospitals across Europe and the Americas, they needed a biological factory.
Right, a guinea pig isn't going to give you enough blood.
No. They needed an animal that could endure massive, repeated doses of the deadly diphtheria toxin, survive the agonizing immunological war, and yield a massive volume of blood without dying.
And that biological factory was the horse. Mota specifically highlights this. Horses were chosen because of their sheer physiological volume. A single draft horse could safely give gallons of antibody-rich blood over its lifetime.
They would inject these majestic animals with the toxin, let them suffer through the fever and the immune response, and then harvest the cure from their veins.
Mota also includes a really cool localized historical nod here, referencing the Instituto Butantan in São Paulo, Brazil.
Oh, yes.
Founded shortly after these discoveries, Butantan became a massive, globally recognized center for producing these exact kinds of immunobiologicals. They scaled up the process, utilizing hundreds of horses to produce not just diphtheria antitoxin, but eventually antivenoms for snake bites, using the exact same biological principle.
So now we have successfully mapped out the medical history. Now we reach the absolute core of Mota's thesis. We have to take this biological blueprint, the horse, the toxin, the blood, the cure, and overlay it onto the theological reality of the cross.
How does the production of diphtheria antitoxin explain the mechanism of spiritual redemption?
Mota maps the variables with surgical precision. He lays out the sequence of events.
Step 1.
Step 1. A lethal toxic agent invades and threatens the life of a host who is incapable of defending themselves.
Yeah.
Step 2. An innocent external organism is deliberately injected with that exact toxic agent.
Okay.
Step 3. The innocent organism absorbs the lethal impact, fights the toxin internally, and defeats it.
Right.
Step 4. Because of that victory, the innocent organism's blood now contains the specific targeted antidote.
Right.
Step 5. That antidote is extracted and injected into the dying patient. Step 6. The dying patient survives, entirely because someone else fought the battle and won it first.
It is an incredibly elegant parallel. In the biological realm, the child survives because the horse defeated the diphtheria toxin. In the spiritual realm, the believer survives because Christ defeated the spiritual toxin.
It's a one-to-one mapping.
But I want to push back on this analogy for a moment, because analogies in theology can be incredibly dangerous if you stretch them too far. They eventually break.
Very true.
A horse in a laboratory is an animal being utilized for its biology. It has no moral agency. Christ on the cross is a completely different ontological reality.
And Mota is an astute enough theologian to recognize the limitations of his own metaphor. He explicitly outlines the divergence where the analogy breaks down, and it revolves around the concept of substitutionary atonement.
Okay, unpack that.
The horse, while enduring the immunological battle, does not die in the child's place. The horse is simply a biological supply chain for a chemical compound. It provides resistance.
It doesn't take on the legal or moral guilt of the child.
Precisely. But in Christian theology, Christ's sacrifice is not merely the transmission of spiritual resistance. It is an actual penal substitution. He assumes the legal penalty of the sin.
So he takes the actual death sentence.
Right. Furthermore, the horse survives the process and goes back to the stable. Christ actually undergoes death, the ultimate consequence of the toxin, and conquers it through resurrection.
Let's define the toxin in this spiritual equation. Mota identifies sin as the ultimate moral toxin. He cites Psalm 51.5, where David writes, "Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me," and Romans 5.12, which argues that sin entered the human race through one man, Adam, and spread to all humanity like a contagion.
Mota is establishing the premise of universal infection. The entire human race is born with a pathogen already active in the system.
We're all infected from day one.
Exactly. And here is where we must address a very common philosophical objection. Many modern thinkers would argue, look at what humanity is capable of. We mapped the genome, we split the atom, we invented vaccines. If we are that brilliant, why can't we engineer our own cure for moral failure?
Basically, why can't we just build a better ethical society and cure ourselves? Why do we need the blood of the lamb?
Mota's answer relies on the concept of total immunological incapacity. In biology, if a healthy adult contracts a mild virus, their immune system can usually mount a defense, produce antibodies, and clear the infection independently. They have innate capacity.
Sure.
But Mota argues that in the spiritual realm, against the specific pathogen of sin, human beings possess zero innate immunological capacity.
A hardware is completely compromised.
Yes, Mota writes that no amount of human effort, not the most rigorous religious discipline, not the highest ethical philosophy, not the strictest moral code, can neutralize the metaphysical guilt of sin.
So all our good works are basically useless against the toxin.
A corrupt nature cannot generate a pure cure. Once the moral toxin has permeated the system, the human spirit is structurally incapable of clearing it. You are the suffocating child. You cannot generate the antibody.
Which fundamentally redefines the concept of religion. Most religious systems are essentially instruction manuals on how to manufacture your own spiritual antibodies through good works.
That's a great way to summarize it.
But Mota points out that the core of the Christian message is the word gospel, derived from the Greek euangelion, which translates literally to good news. The good news is not a new set of instructions on how to fight harder. The good news is the announcement that the external antidote has already been manufactured and is freely available.
And Mota highlights another critical divergence between the biological and the spiritual cures, the permanence of the victory.
Oh, this is fascinating.
In the medical world, passive immunity provided by a horse serum is temporary. The animal antibodies eventually degrade in the human bloodstream, and the patient becomes vulnerable again. Even active vaccines often require booster shots. The biological victory is always degrading.
But the victory achieved by the blood of the lamb is eternal. Mota emphasizes that Christ did not just temporarily suppress the symptoms of sin. He absorbed the full, lethal dose of the moral toxin, neutralized it completely without ever being corrupted by it himself, and offers an antidote that doesn't just immunize the believer, but permanently justifies and regenerates them.
And to truly comprehend the staggering cost of producing that permanent spiritual antidote, Mota turns his attention to one of the most mysterious and debated narratives in the biblical text. He takes us to the Garden of Gethsemane on the night before the crucifixion.
This is where the synthesis of theology and biology reaches its absolute peak. Mota offers a reinterpretation of Jesus in Gethsemane that completely shattered my preconceived notions.
This is very powerful.
I want to set the scene carefully for you. Mota is pulling from the gospel accounts, primarily Matthew 26. Jesus is in an olive grove with his closest disciples. It is late at night. He knows Judas is currently betraying him, and the Roman soldiers are on their way.
And the text describes a sudden, overwhelming psychological and physical collapse. Jesus tells his disciples, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death."
He literally falls down.
He falls face down on the ground, agonizing in prayer, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me." Luke's gospel adds a terrifying medical detail. Jesus was in such immense agony that his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground.
That is a documented medical phenomenon called hematotrosis. It's where extreme, unbearable psychological stress causes the capillaries in the sweat glands to literally rupture.
It takes an unbelievable amount of stress to trigger that.
So, my question, and the central question Moto poses, is why? Why was the author of Life sweating blood? The standard superficial answer you always hear is that he was terrified of the physical torture. He knew about the whip, the nails, the cross, and the asphyxiation, and he was experiencing a perfectly natural human dread of a horrific execution.
But Mota argues that if you look closely at the theological data, that standard explanation is entirely illogical. It actually undermines the very nature of who Christ is claimed to be.
How so?
Mota points out that the New Testament presents Jesus as the firstborn from the dead and the Prince of Life.
Yeah.
In John 10:18, Jesus explicitly states that no one takes his life from him, but that he has the authority to lay it down and the authority to take it back up again.
For the creator of the universe, the entity who authored the biological concept of life, the temporary cessation of biological function, physical death, is not an ontological threat. It doesn't threaten his eternal existence.
Exactly. But Mota makes an even more devastating comparative argument. Look at the historical record of human martyrdom.
Oh, this part blew my mind.
Throughout the centuries following the crucifixion, thousands of mere human beings, men, women, teenagers, faced horrific executions for their faith. We have accounts of early church fathers like Polycarp, who stood at the stake and praised God as the fires were lit.
Right.
We have accounts of believers singing hymns as they were torn apart by lions in Roman amphitheaters.
They faced the exact same physical terror, sometimes even worse torture, and they did it with astonishing courage and peace.
So Mota asks, does it make any rational sense that the incarnate God, the very source of the grace that sustained those human martyrs in the flames, would be completely paralyzed, sweating blood, begging for a way out, terrified of a physical death that his own followers would later face with a song on their lips?
It makes no sense. He cannot possess less courage than a human martyr. Therefore, the agony in the garden was not driven by the fear of the nails.
So what was in the cup? If he wasn't flinching from the physical torture, what was causing a psychological stress so immense that it ruptured his capillaries?
Mota argues that the key to unlocking Gethsemane is understanding the concept of eternal communion. To grasp the terror, you have to understand the profound intimacy of the Trinity.
Right, the relationship between the Father and the Son.
Mota traces this through the Gospel of John, quoting Jesus saying, "I and the Father are one." He references the high priestly prayer in John 17, where Jesus speaks of the glory and love he shared with the Father before the creation of the world.
They have existed in a state of perfect, unbroken, infinitely joyful communion for all of eternity past. There has never been a millisecond of separation between them.
Now, bring the scientific analogy of the vaccine back into focus. What is the prerequisite for manufacturing the antidote? The innocent organism must be deliberately injected with the deadly toxin.
Mota argues that Gethsemane was the moment Jesus was staring down the syringe. The cup he was asking to pass was not the cup of physical death. It was the cup containing the concentrated, lethal moral toxicity of the entire human race.
And what is the primary mechanistic effect of the toxin of sin? Mota quotes the prophet Isaiah, chapter 59, verse 2. "But your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sins have hidden his face from you so that he will not hear."
The function of sin is separation. It violently severs communion with the holy.
Therefore, as Jesus knelt in the garden, he realized that to become the ultimate substitute, to absorb the sin of humanity, he would have to experience the one thing he had never known in all of eternity: a complete, catastrophic severing of his communion with the Father.
He was about to be cut off from the source of all light and life. The agony that caused him to sweat blood was the impending, unimaginable horror of eternal spiritual isolation.
It is a profound reframing of the Passion narrative. The physical cross was merely the altar where the spiritual transaction took place. Mota tracks this timeline right up to the climax of the crucifixion. He points to the cry of dereliction in Matthew 27:46.
When the sky goes dark.
Right. Jesus is hanging on the wood, the sky goes dark, and he screams out, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which translates to, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
In Mota's framework, that cry marks the exact moment the plunger was pushed down on the syringe. That is the moment the moral toxin hit the immaculate bloodstream.
The communion breaks.
That is the moment the eternal communion was fractured, and Jesus, as Mota writes, became the total receptacle of all human toxicity. He took the full lethal dose of separation that humanity deserved.
He allowed the pathogen of sin to do its absolute worst to him. He endured the spiritual asphyxiation, just like the horse endures the biological diphtheria toxin. But because his nature was perfectly pure, the toxin could not ultimately corrupt him.
He absorbed the penalty, exhausted the destructive power of the sin within his own being, and neutralized the pathogen.
And how does Mota prove that the internal battle was won? How do we know the antidote was successfully synthesized?
The resurrection on the third day. The fact that the grave could not hold him is the empirical, historical proof that the toxin of sin and death was completely defeated. The ultimate antidote was produced, and through the preaching of the gospel, it is now available for infusion into anyone who recognizes their infection and desires life.
It fundamentally changes how you visualize the theology of the cross. You really see the mechanics of substitution. But what makes this book so compelling is that Mota doesn't just leave us in the realm of ancient theology.
No, he takes a huge pivot.
He doesn't close the book after explaining the spiritual antidote. He pivots hard. He argues that because the empirical science of immunology provides the perfect language to explain the sacred truth of redemption, he has a profound moral obligation to defend that very science against the modern cultural forces attempting to destroy it.
It is a fascinating transition, going from deep theological exposition directly into aggressive public health advocacy. Mota moves our attention to the modern battlefield.
Yeah.
He points out that we are currently living through a unique crisis in human history, driven by what he calls digital information and communication technologies. We have built a global infrastructure capable of transmitting information instantaneously, but we have completely failed to build an infrastructure to verify the truth of that information.
Now, to fully understand Mota's sense of urgency in this final section, it's vital to frame his context objectively. We are just relaying the author's historical observations here. He is writing in a specific historical moment, analyzing how information systems are manipulated on a massive scale.
He explicitly points to the strategies utilized during the 2016 elections in the United States and the 2018 elections in Brazil.
He uses these as macro examples of a new paradigm where bad actors weaponize algorithms. They take a tiny sliver of truth, wrap it in a massive layer of emotional lies, and deploy it to confuse the public and destabilize institutions.
And Mota's argument is that the exact same digital tactics used to manipulate political outcomes, the amplification of outrage, the fabrication of conspiracies, the targeting of algorithmic echo chambers, are now being aggressively weaponized against the medical establishment, and specifically against the concept of vaccines.
He views this as an absolute tragedy. From his perspective, biological vaccines are arguably the greatest physical survival mechanism humanity has ever discovered.
Before mass immunization, diseases operated like indiscriminate scythes through the population. Yes, the discovery of antibiotics was a massive leap forward for bacterial infections, and the implementation of basic municipal hygiene and clean water saved millions.
But for viral horrors like smallpox, polio, and measles, the vaccine is the primary, indispensable wall of defense.
So Mota sets out to systematically defend the physical antidote. He takes on the anti-science movement point by point. He starts by addressing the pervasive argument regarding efficacy.
You see this online a lot.
Right. You often see misinformation campaigns highlighting rare cases where a vaccinated individual still contracted the disease. They use that statistical outlier to claim that the entire concept of vaccination is a failure and therefore shouldn't be utilized.
To dismantle that logic, Mota uses a brilliant, universally understood analogy: the seatbelt.
Let's expand on the physics of his analogy. When you get into a car and buckle your seatbelt, you are not engaging a magical force field that guarantees your absolute survival in any conceivable crash.
If you get hit by a freight train at 90 miles an hour, the seatbelt is not going to save you.
No. The seatbelt, along with cars' crumple zones and airbags, is a mechanism designed to drastically reduce the transfer of lethal kinetic energy to your body.
But nobody in their right mind argues, well, I read a news story about a guy who wore a seatbelt and still died in a catastrophic crash, therefore seatbelts are useless and I refuse to wear one.
That would be absurd.
The statistical reality is undeniable. Wearing a seatbelt exponentially increases your odds of survival in the vast majority of collisions. Mota argues that vaccines function exactly the same way. They are a biological seatbelt.
If a vaccinated person is exposed to a heavy viral load and the virus manages to break through, their pre-trained immune system will still fight the infection much more effectively. It drastically reduces the severity of the symptoms and prevents hospitalization and death compared to an unvaccinated person.
And Mota insists that the conversation cannot just be about individual risk calculation, it is fundamentally about community protection. He explains the vital concept of herd immunity.
This is pure mathematics and epidemiology. When a pathogen enters a population, it relies on finding vulnerable hosts to replicate and spread. Every vaccinated person acts as a firebreak.
So if the virus hits a vaccinated person, it cannot replicate efficiently, and the chain of transmission is broken.
This is where the moral weight of the argument drops. By getting vaccinated, you aren't just protecting yourself, you are actively shielding the most vulnerable members of your community.
Infants who are too young to receive their shots, elderly individuals whose immune systems are fading, or cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy who literally cannot be immunized. Your immunity is their only shield.
Which explains Mota's incredibly sharp tone when addressing the architects of digital misinformation. He states quite bluntly that indulging in certain online conspiracies like arguing that the Earth is flat or that the moon landings were faked might indicate a severe lack of scientific literacy, but it is ultimately harmless nonsense.
Believing the Earth is flat doesn't kill your neighbor.
But playing around with vaccine conspiracy theories is the equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded theater while simultaneously locking the exit doors. It actively endangers human lives, specifically the lives of defenseless children, by eroding the herd immunity that keeps deadly pathogens at bay.
Mota then takes the time to systematically debunk two of the most pervasive, dangerous myths circulating in these digital echo chambers.
Let's break down myth number 1. The persistent idea that vaccines are filled with toxic ingredients. You see this everywhere online. Someone will post a scary-looking graphic listing chemical compounds found in a vaccine syringe, things like formaldehyde or aluminum salts, and the immediate emotional reaction is terror.
Naturally, why would I inject a toxin into my child?
Mota counters this by teaching the reader the absolute foundational rule of toxicology, a principle established centuries ago by Paracelsus. The dose makes the poison. The word toxic is entirely meaningless without the context of volume.
People forget that human beings are walking bags of chemicals. We ingest, inhale, and process complex chemical compounds every second of our existence.
Water is an absolute necessity for biological life. But if you drink 2 gallons of water in an hour, you will alter your body's electrolyte balance, suffer water intoxication, and potentially die.
Oxygen is vital, but prolonged exposure to pure oxygen under high pressure causes fatal oxygen toxicity in the central nervous system.
The dose matters. Mota points out that the trace amounts of chemicals used in vaccines are astronomically small. For example, there's significantly more naturally occurring formaldehyde in a single piece of fruit, like a pear, than there is in any vaccine.
These microscopic ingredients aren't there to poison you. They are essential functional components. They are adjuvants designed to stimulate a stronger immune response, or they are preservatives necessary to keep the vial sterile and prevent deadly bacterial contamination during global transport. The ingredients are rigorously tested and demonstrably safe at the manufactured doses.
That brings us to myth number 2, which is arguably the most destructive piece of medical misinformation in modern history, the supposed causal link between vaccines and autism.
Mota addresses this head-on. To understand why this myth refuses to die, you have to understand human psychology and the desperate need for parents to find an explanation for a frightening diagnosis.
That's heartbreaking, really.
Mota explains that this myth is fueled by a tragic coincidence of timing, resulting in a massive fallacy where correlation is mistaken for causation.
Let's look at the developmental timeline. The signs and symptoms of autism spectrum disorder, which Mota refers to by the Portuguese acronym TEA, are related to complex neurodevelopmental factors. Those behavioral markers naturally begin to manifest and become recognizable to parents and pediatricians, typically between 18 and 24 months of age.
And coincidentally, that 18 to 24-month developmental window happens to be the exact same time frame when children are scheduled to receive several of their major early childhood booster shots.
So a parent takes their healthy-seeming child to the clinic, the child receives a vaccine, and a month or two later, the parent notices that the child is losing language skills or avoiding eye contact.
The human brain is wired to connect events chronologically. The parent sees the needle, then sees the autism, and concludes the needle caused the autism.
It is a completely understandable human reaction, but it is scientifically false. Mota points to the overwhelming mountain of empirical data. Following a fraudulent, later retracted 1998 study that originally sparked this panic, the global scientific community launched massive, independent studies spanning decades.
They analyzed the medical records of literally millions of children across multiple continents.
And the data is unanimous and definitive. There is absolutely zero causal link between vaccines and autism. Getting vaccinated does not increase a child's risk of developing autism, even in children who are genetically predisposed to the spectrum. It's a fabricated connection.
To bring his defense to a close, Mota asks the reader to step back and look at the ultimate risk ratio. We live in a digital age where an algorithm can feed you 100 terrifying anecdotes about anything in 10 minutes. Are vaccines 100% devoid of side effects?
No, nothing in biology is. But what is the actual risk?
Mota acknowledges the reality of side effects, but he points out that the overwhelming majority of adverse reactions to vaccines are incredibly mild and transient. We are talking about a low-grade fever, some localized soreness or redness at the injection site, or perhaps a day of fatigue as the immune system goes to work building the antibodies.
What about the horror stories? What about the severe reactions?
Mota doesn't hide from them. He notes that in incredibly rare, statistically minute cases, literally a 1 in a million scenario, an individual might experience a severe anaphylactic allergic reaction to a specific component in the vaccine. It happens.
But it happens in the exact same way that a tiny percentage of the population has a severe, life-threatening allergic reaction to eating a peanut or taking penicillin or getting stung by a bee. We don't burn down peanut farms or ban antibiotics because of rare allergies.
And crucially, as Mota points out, if a rare allergic reaction to a vaccine does occur, it almost always happens immediately in the clinic, where medical professionals are standing by with epinephrine to manage and neutralize the reaction safely.
Compare that manageable microscopic risk to the alternative. The diseases these vaccines prevent, the choking pseudomembrane of diphtheria, the paralysis of polio, the brain inflammation of measles, are highly contagious, devastating, and exponentially more difficult to treat once they take hold in an unvaccinated population.
The mathematical reality is undeniable. The incredible manageable safety profile of the vaccine stands in stark contrast to the catastrophic, indiscriminate danger of the unchecked disease.
Therefore, Mota concludes that despite the constant noise of the digital age, objective research, historical precedent, and lived reality prove clearly that vaccines are safe, effective, and absolutely vital for the survival of both the individual and the community.
It really changes how you look at the world. We started this deep dive in the murky, abstract waters of ancient theology, trying to understand how humanity could possibly survive an internal corruption, an external systemic seduction, and the targeted deception of a personal adversary.
We learned that the human spirit is completely incapable of manufacturing its own moral cure.
We then watched as Mota brilliantly utilized the empirical, grueling history of medical immunology to give us a mechanical blueprint for that salvation. We saw how the biological miracle of an innocent horse taking a lethal injection of diphtheria toxin to produce a life-saving serum for a dying child perfectly mirrors the profound mystery of the cross.
We stood in Gethsemane and realized that Jesus wasn't sweating blood in fear of Roman nails. He was experiencing the sheer, unadulterated terror of absorbing the moral toxicity of the world and severing eternal communion with the Father to produce our ultimate antidote.
And finally, we saw why objective truth, whether we are talking about the theological truth of spiritual redemption or the scientific truth of biological immunology, must be fiercely, uncompromisingly defended against a modern culture addicted to misinformation. The antidote on every level is simply too precious to lose to a conspiracy theory.
As we conclude our analysis of Mota's fascinating work, there is one final, overarching implication that the text points toward. It's something that ties the biology and the theology together in a way that challenges our modern obsession with fierce independence.
I love a good provocative thought to end on. What is it?
Consider the fundamental architecture of our survival. Humanity's greatest physical defense mechanism against the invisible world of pathogens. Our ability to utilize vaccines, harvest antibodies, and leverage acquired immunity relies entirely on the concept of substitution.
Someone else has to take the hit.
Exactly. Someone else or some other organism has to encounter the threat and build the defense for us to borrow. Simultaneously, our ultimate spiritual salvation, the doctrine of redemption, relies on that exact same mechanism of substitution.
Right.
An innocent party must take the lethal hit to provide the cure. So if both our biological survival and our spiritual salvation fundamentally demand an external savior, what does that reveal about our true nature? Are we, from the microscopic level of our cellular biology all the way up to the eternal state of our souls, hardwired to be utterly incapable of saving ourselves in isolation? Are we designed to realize that true life is never generated from within, but must always be received as a gift through the sacrifice of another?
That is a staggering thought to carry with you. We are not designed for independence, we are designed for rescue. Thank you so much for joining us on this custom-tailored deep dive into the extraordinary intersection of scientific mechanics and biblical theology. Until next time, keep examining the evidence, keep asking the hard questions, and always look for the connections hidden just beneath the surface.